There's a sound a room makes when the person everyone dismissed suddenly becomes the most important man in it. It's not loud. It's the opposite of loud. It's the silence that happens when a commanding officer walks into a family living room, glances at a photograph pinned to the wall, and then does something nobody expects. He straightens his spine, he squares his shoulders, and he stands at attention for the old man in the armchair who was just being laughed at 3 weeks earlier. That moment didn't happen by accident. It started 3 weeks earlier at a family dinner when a young soldier brought his new army girlfriend home to meet his father and decided to mock the old man's medals right in front of her. "Dad and his ridiculous costume jewelry," he said, laughing. What he didn't know was that his girlfriend would mention it to her commanding officer. What nobody in that room knew was that the old man in the chair wasn't just a veteran. He was a name the Army still whispers in certain circles. And the photograph pinned to the wall, the one that stopped a commanding officer cold, had a story no one was ready to hear. Let me tell you about Robert Kincaid. In the spring of 1991, he was 23 years old, a specialist in the United States Army, sitting in the belly of a Bradley fighting vehicle as it rolled across the Iraqi desert in the opening hours of the ground war. By the time the ceasefire was declared 4 days later, Specialist Kincaid had done things that would earn him citations most soldiers only read about. By the time he left the service in 1996, he had a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster. He also had a promise to himself that he would never talk about any of it. For the next 28 years, Robert Kincaid kept that promise. He moved back to his hometown of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, took a job as a high school history teacher, and lived in a modest 2-story house on Chestnut Street with a front porch that needed repainting every 3rd summer. He married a woman named Diane, who knew about the medals in the shoebox in the closet but never pressed him to display them. They had one son, Jason, born in 1998. Diane passed away from cancer when Jason was 16, and after that, it was just Robert and the boy. Robert did his best. He showed up to baseball games, helped with homework, and said nothing about the things he had done in the desert when he was barely older than the seniors he taught. Jason Kincaid grew up knowing his father had served. He knew about the shoebox. He had seen the medals once or twice, a jumble of ribbons and metal in the back of the closet, and his father's only explanation had been, "Everybody got those back then." Jason believed him. This was not Jason's fault. Robert had deliberately made himself unremarkable, and boys believe what their fathers tell them. At 23, Jason enlisted in the Army. He did it partly out of a vague desire to serve, partly because college was expensive and the GI Bill made sense, and partly, though he would never have admitted it, to step out from under the quiet shadow of a man he loved but never quite understood. He did well in basic training, was assigned to Fort Campbell, and 6 months into his enlistment, he met a girl. Her name was Specialist Emily Torres. She was sharp, disciplined, and came from a military family. Her father had been a ranger, her grandfather had jumped into Normandy, and she could read a uniform ribbon rack like most people read street signs. Jason was crazy about her. When he brought her home to Harrisburg for a weekend in late October, he wanted everything to be perfect. The dinner was on a Friday night. Jason had told Emily his father was a veteran, but that he never talked about it, and there was a shoebox somewhere with some old medals that were probably just campaign ribbons. Emily had nodded politely and said nothing. When they arrived, Robert welcomed them warmly. He was a quiet man in a flannel shirt, with a full head of silver hair cut high and tight, and a bearing that Emily, who had spent her entire life around soldiers, clocked immediately. The way he stood when he opened the door, the way his eyes moved, never wasting motion. She said nothing because it was not her house and not her family, but she filed it under interesting and waited. After dinner, Jason took Emily on a tour of the small house. In the hallway, there was a photograph pinned to the wall above a bookshelf. It showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, squinting into harsh sunlight, a Bradley vehicle in the background. The faces were young and dusty. One of them was Robert Kincaid, almost unrecognizable, thin and sharp. And pinned beside the photograph in a simple frame was something Emily Torres recognized instantly: a Silver Star citation. She stopped cold. Jason, not noticing, gestured toward the hallway closet. "Oh yeah, Dad's ridiculous costume jewelry is in there somewhere," he said, laughing. "He's got a whole box of old medals, never shuts up about it." The sarcasm dripped. He was trying to be funny, to show his new girlfriend that he wasn't one of those soldiers who took everything too seriously, that he could make a joke. He had no idea what he was looking at. Emily looked at the citation, then at Robert, who had appeared silently in the hallway doorway. Their eyes met. In that single look, she understood two things. The first was that this man had heard what his son said. The second was that he had chosen, with deliberate and practiced discipline, to let it pass. The weekend ended. Emily and Jason drove back to Fort Campbell. Jason talked about the food, about the weather, about a dozen things that did not matter. Emily stared out the window, replaying the image of that citation in her mind. The phrasing, the date, the word valor. Back on post, Emily did something Jason did not expect. She pulled up the Army's digital archives and typed a name into the search field. What came back made her sit perfectly still for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her commanding officer. Captain Marcus Reyes had served in Desert Storm as a young lieutenant. He had been there, in the same theater, in the same 100 hours. When Emily described what she had seen and read the name aloud, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Captain Reyes said, very quietly, "Specialist, I think I need to meet your boyfriend's father." 3 weeks later, a car pulled up in front of the Kincaid house on Chestnut Street. Jason was inside, visiting for the weekend again, this time alone. He had no idea why Emily had asked him to be there, only that she said it was important and that her was coming too. He thought it was strange, but he didn't ask too many questions because the tone in her voice had not invited argument. Captain Reyes stepped out of the car in dress uniform. Emily was beside him. They walked up the porch steps. Jason opened the door, confused, and welcomed them inside. Robert Kincaid was sitting in his armchair, reading a book, wearing a worn cardigan and the same calm expression he always wore. And then Captain Reyes, a man who had led soldiers in combat, a man who did not startle easily, walked into the living room and saw the photograph pinned to the wall. The one from the desert, 1991. He stopped. He stared. His spine straightened. His shoulders squared. His hand came up in a salute so sharp and so sudden that Jason felt the air in the room change before his brain could catch up. Captain Reyes spoke a single sentence, and every assumption Jason Kincaid had ever made about his father shattered on the living room floor. "Specialist Kincaid," Captain Reyes said, his voice catching on the rank, "you never told your son you saved my life." The room did not move. Jason stood frozen near the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his mind cycling through those words like a computer failing to boot. Emily stood behind Captain Reyes, her eyes wet, her jaw tight. And Robert Kincaid, 71 years old, wearing a cardigan with a worn elbow, looked up from his armchair with the same expression he'd worn for 28 years. Calm, measured. The face of a man who had already faced the worst things a human being can face, and had long since stopped being surprised by anything life still had to throw at him. He set his book down on the side table. He took off his reading glasses, and he said, very quietly, "Marcus, sit down, son." Captain Reyes did not sit. He took one step forward, his eyes locked on the photograph pinned to the wall. "Task Force 216, he said, his voice regimental now, as if reading from a citation. "February 27, 1991. The battle for Objective Norfolk East. My Bradley took a hit from an Iraqi T-72. The driver was killed instantly. The vehicle commander was pinned under the turret basket, bleeding out. I was 23 years old, a second lieutenant who had been in country for 11 days, and I was trapped in the troop compartment with shrapnel in my leg and smoke filling the cabin. And then the rear hatch opened, and a specialist from 3rd Squad pulled me out while the fuel tanks were still cooking off. He paused. He looked at Robert. I never knew his name. I asked years later. The after-action reports listed it as unknown specialist, extraction under fire. I tried to find him. I couldn't. Robert Kincaid stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate, the way a man stands when his body has decades of muscle memory for holding formation. He walked to the wall, took down the framed citation, and handed it to Captain Reyes. It's not unknown, he said. It's just that nobody asked me. Jason had not moved. His mouth was open. His hand had dropped from the doorknob and was now hanging at his side, useless. He watched his father, the man who taught 10th grade history, who packed his lunch in a brown paper bag every morning, who complained about the squirrels in the attic and never fixed the squeak on the 3rd porch step. He watched him hand a Silver Star citation to a captain in dress uniform like it was a grocery receipt. And the thing that was breaking Jason's brain, the thing that would keep him awake for nights afterward, was not the medal. It was the silence. The 28 years of silence. The fact that he had grown up in this house, had walked past that hallway photograph 1,000 times, had called the medals in the shoebox costume jewelry in front of the woman he loved, and his father had said nothing. Not because he couldn't speak. Because he had chosen a specific, deliberate, and absolute silence, and he had held it for so long that it had become the architecture of his entire life. But here's the thing about silence. It only works until someone who knows the truth walks through the door. Captain Reyes took the citation from Robert's hands with the reverence of a man accepting a sacred object. He read it aloud, his voice steady now, filling the small living room with words that had been locked in a frame for decades. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, Specialist Robert Kincaid distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism while serving as a rifleman with Company Bravo, 1st Battalion, 41st Infantry Regiment. On 27 February 1991, during coordinated offensive operations against Iraqi armored forces, Specialist Kincaid voluntarily, and without regard for his own safety, breached a burning armored vehicle under heavy enemy fire and successfully extracted 2 wounded personnel. His actions directly resulted in the preservation of life and were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. When he finished, the silence that followed was not the same silence as before. The silence before had been comfortable, the silence of a quiet man in a quiet house. This silence was heavy. It was the silence of something enormous being placed gently in the center of a room, and everyone present understanding that nothing would ever be the same. Jason found his voice. It came out smaller than he intended. Dad. Robert turned to look at his son. There was no anger in his face, no resentment, just a quiet sadness that Jason had never seen before, and it was worse than anything else he could have imagined. You asked me once, Robert said, when you were about 12 years old, what the medals were for. I told you everybody got those back then, and you believed me because I made it easy to believe. I didn't want you carrying what I carried. I made fun of you, Jason said. The words seemed to cost him something physical, like he was pushing them out against a weight. In front of Emily, I called them costume jewelry. I said you never shut up about it. I remember. Why didn't you say anything? Robert Kincaid looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Emily, who was now standing beside Captain Reyes, one hand resting on his arm. Then he looked at the photograph on the wall, the young faces in the desert, the men who had been there and the ones who had not come home. Because it's not something you say, he said. Jason, there are things that happen to a man in war that don't fit into conversation. They don't fit into family dinners. They don't fit into a life you're trying to build that's clean and quiet and normal. I didn't want my war to become your burden, and I figured, if you ever needed to know, life would find a way to tell you. Captain Reyes, who had been standing like a soldier at parade rest, broke protocol and stepped forward. He placed the citation back in Robert's hands. Life found a way, he said. Your son's girlfriend read that citation and called me. She described the photograph, the unit patch, the date, and I knew. I've been looking for you for 16 years, Specialist Kincaid. I'm not a specialist anymore, Robert said. I haven't been for a long time. You'll always be a specialist to the men you pulled out of that Bradley, Reyes said. 2 men. You pulled out 2. The driver was already gone, but me and Sergeant Morrison. He's alive today. He's a grandfather now in Tennessee. He talks about the unknown specialist every year on the anniversary, every single year. Jason's knees gave out. He sat down on the arm of the sofa, not because he chose to, but because his body made a decision his brain hadn't caught up to. Emily moved toward him, but he held up a hand. Not now. Not yet. He needed to process what was happening, and for a young man who had spent his whole life believing his father was a simple history teacher, processing was going to take more than a few minutes. Let me pause here and tell you something about what happens when a son discovers his father is not the man he thought he was. It's not a single event. It's a cascade. First comes the shock, the raw disbelief that the quiet old man who trimmed the hedges and watched baseball and complained about property taxes had once moved through fire to save lives he didn't know. Then comes something unexpected. It's not pride. Not at first. It's grief. Grief for the version of his father he thought he knew. Grief for the years of casual disrespect, the rolled eyes, the unthinking dismissal. Grief for all the conversations they never had because the silence had been too well built. And then, only then, comes the pride. But Jason was still on step 1. "Dad," he said again, and now his voice cracked the way young men's voices do when they refuse to cry and fail. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Robert said. "I never needed you to know. I needed you to be okay, and you are, that's enough." "It's not enough." That was Emily. She stepped forward now, her voice clear and direct, the voice of a soldier addressing a situation that required honesty. "Sir, with respect, it's not enough. Your son is a soldier now. He's going to go places and see things and carry his own burden someday, and he needs to understand what came before him, not just the medals, the man." Robert studied her. The young specialist with the Ranger father and the Normandy grandfather, the girl who could read a ribbon rack like a language. He saw something in her that he recognized. "You're the one who put this together," he said. "I saw the citation. I knew what it meant. I called Captain Reyes because I thought he should know. I didn't expect." She gestured at the room, at the captain standing with wet eyes in dress uniform, at Jason slumped on the sofa, at the framed citation still in Robert's hands. "I didn't expect this." "Nobody ever does," Robert said. "That's the thing about the truth. It doesn't ask permission." Captain Reyes cleared his throat. "Specialist Kincaid, Robert, I didn't come here just to thank you. The Army has a process for recognizing service members whose actions were underdocumented or unrecognized. Given what I know now and what I can testify to officially, I want to submit your name for an upgrade consideration. Your Silver Star citation describes actions that may warrant the Distinguished Service Cross." He paused. "And more importantly, your son deserves to hear the rest of the story, the part that's not in the citation." Robert looked at the photograph on the wall, the young faces, the Bradley, the desert. "That's not a short story," he said. "I have all afternoon," Captain Reyes said. "So does your son." And so, in the living room on Chestnut Street, with the autumn light slanting through the windows and a shoebox full of medals sitting in the hallway closet, Robert Kincaid began to speak. He told them about the morning of February 27th, when the order came down to push through Objective Norfolk East, and his squad's Bradley had been positioned on the left flank. He told them about the sound an anti-tank round makes when it hits armor, a sound you never forget, like a giant hammer striking an anvil underwater. He told them about the smoke, the screaming, the way his body moved before his mind caught up, the heat of the metal when he grabbed the rear hatch handle. He told them about the weight of a grown man in full kit, dragging him through sand while rounds snapped overhead. He told them about the second man, Sergeant Morrison, who was pinned and crying and saying he didn't want to die. and how Robert had gone back in, because there was no version of his future self that could live with having not gone back in. Jason listened. He did not move. He did not speak. He listened the way you listen to something you have waited your whole life to hear without knowing you were waiting. But the story did not end at the extraction. And what came next, what Robert said after a long pause and a deep breath, was something that even Captain Reyes had not known. The part that was not in any citation. The part that had kept Robert Kincaid silent for 28 years. And that part is what changed everything. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski was 19 years old. He was the driver of the Bradley. He had enlisted out of a small town in Ohio, sent money home to his mother, and told his younger sister in his last letter that he'd be home by Easter. His hatch took the anti-tank round directly. When Robert Kincaid wrenched open the rear door and climbed into that burning compartment, Kowalski was already gone. There was nothing anyone could have done. The damage was instantaneous. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not the same. And for 28 years, Robert Kincaid had felt the weight of that hatch he never opened in time. Every medal, every citation, every handshake from a grateful officer. He accepted them all with the same quiet nod and filed them away because every time he looked at the silver star, he didn't see the two men he pulled out. He saw the one he couldn't. That's the math that soldiers do in silence. You save two, you lose one, and you spend the rest of your life subtracting. The citation didn't mention Kowalski. It never does. Citations are written about what you accomplished, not what you failed to prevent. But Robert had memorized the failure. He had tattooed it on the inside of his ribs and let it shape the entire architecture of his life. He told his wife Diane about Kowalski exactly once. It was 2 months into their marriage, late at night, after he'd woken up shaking from a dream he couldn't describe. She held his hand in the dark and listened. When he finished, she said, "You came back, that's all that matters." But Robert knew it wasn't all that mattered. It couldn't be. Because if you let yourself believe that coming back was enough, then you had to let go of the guilt, and the guilt was the only thing he still had of Kowalski. It was, in a way he could never explain, the only memorial he knew how to build. So he kept it. He fed it. He let it grow into the silence that became his personality, his parenting, his whole quiet life. When Jason was born, Robert made a decision. His son would never carry this. The boy would grow up in a house where war was a closed door, where the medals were just metal in a box, where the man who trimmed the hedges and graded quizzes and never raised his voice was simply a father. No ghosts, no guilt, no subtraction. And for 23 years it had worked, until tonight. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, Captain Reyes said slowly, testing the name as if it were a key to a door he hadn't known existed. I remember his name from the casualty report. He was the only KIA in my vehicle. I wrote his family a letter afterward. I told them he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. I hope that was true. Robert looked at the captain who had been a bleeding lieutenant in his arms. It was true, he said. I saw him. It was instant, and I should have gotten there faster. You breached a burning vehicle under fire, Reyes said. You pulled 2 men out of a compartment that was filling with smoke and fuel vapor. You did it while rounds were still hitting the hull. If you'd been 1 second faster, you might have died yourself, and Sergeant Morrison and I would be dead, and no one would know any of this. I know that, Robert said. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor underneath it, the faint vibration of something held back for too long. I've known it for 28 years. I've told myself that exact thing 1,000 times, and it has never, not once, made the guilt any smaller. Emily Torres took a step forward. She had been silent for most of the conversation, the discipline of a specialist in the presence of senior rank, but something in Robert's voice broke through the protocol. Sir, she said, my grandfather jumped into Normandy. He lost men, friends he'd trained with since basic. He talked about them sometimes, late at night, when he thought no one was listening. He carried them his whole life, but he didn't let them erase what he'd done. He said carrying the dead is part of the job, but so is carrying the living. Robert looked at her. The young specialist with the sharp eyes who had read his citation and made a phone call. "You're wise for your age," he said. "My grandfather was," she said. "I'm just the messenger." Jason, who had not spoken in several minutes, who had been sitting on the arm of the sofa with his hands locked together and his head down, finally lifted his eyes. His face was wet. He didn't try to hide it. "You never told me any of this," he said. "I grew up 10 feet from that photograph. I walked past it every day. And you let me think you were just some guy. Some quiet guy who taught history and didn't have anything worth talking about." "I wanted you to have a quiet life," Robert said. "I didn't want a quiet life," Jason said. "I wanted a father I understood. I enlisted because I thought maybe the army would give me something you couldn't. Something that felt important. And the whole time, the most important thing in my life was sitting in that armchair, reading a book, letting me believe he was nobody." The word nobody landed in the room and stayed there. Robert absorbed it without flinching, but something shifted in his expression. The calm mask, the one he had worn for nearly 3 decades, developed a small crack, not because he was angry, because he was seeing for the first time the cost of his silence from the other side. Captain Reyes cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "Something I need to tell you both." He looked at Robert, then at Jason. "When I realized who your father was, I didn't just put on my uniform and drive to Harrisburg. I filed a formal request with the Army's Human Resources Command. There's a review board, the Valor 24 board, that re-examines historical citations using modern evidence and testimony. Given what I've submitted, what I can testify to, and what Sergeant Morrison will corroborate from Tennessee, there is a strong possibility that Specialist Kincaid's Silver Star will be upgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross." Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air like a flag unfurling in slow motion. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest award for valor in the United States Army. Only the Medal of Honor ranks above it. It is not given lightly. It is not given often, and it had never once been mentioned in the Kincaid household. Robert shook his head. "I don't need that," he said. "This isn't about need," Reyes said. "It's about accuracy. The citation you have doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't mention the volume of enemy fire. It doesn't mention that you re-entered the vehicle after already extracting 1 casualty. It doesn't mention that the fuel tanks were cooking off and the vehicle was moments from catastrophic explosion. Those details were lost in the fog of a fast-moving ground offensive. But they're not lost anymore. I was there. Morrison was there. We can fill in the gaps." Jason stood up. He crossed the room and stopped directly in front of his father. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jason said, "Dad, you have to let them do this." "I don't have to do anything," Robert said quietly. "Yes, you do." Jason's voice was unsteady but determined, the voice of a young soldier who was learning in real time what it meant to stand his ground. "You owe it to Kowalski. You said you've been carrying him for 28 years. If you let this happen, if you let the Army recognize what you actually did, then his name gets attached to something larger than a closed-door memory. He becomes part of a story people tell. A story about a soldier who went into a burning vehicle and saved as many as he could. That's a memorial, that's a real one, not guilt you carry alone in the dark, something that honors him." Robert stared at his son. The crack in the mask widened. "You sound like your mother," he said. "I hope so," Jason said. "She would have told you to stop hiding." Emily stepped forward and stood beside Jason. She didn't touch him, but her presence was deliberate. "Sir," she said to Robert, "with all respect, the Army doesn't give you a choice about what the truth is. The citation is a record. It belongs to history, not just to you. Your son is a soldier now. He's going to carry his own burden someday, and the story of his father might be the thing that gets him through it." Captain Reyes reached into his uniform jacket and produced a single sheet of paper folded neatly. "This is the preliminary upgrade recommendation," he said. "It's not final. It will go through review boards, a whole chain of approvals, but it starts with your signature." He placed the paper on the coffee table. "I'm not going to pressure you. I came here to thank you, and that's already done. But if you sign this, Robert, the Army will hold a formal ceremony. on a base of your choosing, with your family present, and I will be there in uniform, reading the new citation aloud for the record, forever. The room went quiet again, the kind of quiet that exists inside a decision that hasn't been made yet. Robert Kincaid looked at the paper on the coffee table. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the young faces in the desert, the Bradley in the background. He looked at the shoebox in the hallway closet, still sitting where it had sat for nearly 3 decades, full of metal that he had never once worn in public. And then he looked at his son who had called the metals costume jewelry. His son who was now standing in front of him with tears on his face and a spine that had straightened over the course of a single afternoon. His son who had enlisted, perhaps, to find something, and had instead found that the thing was here all along. I spent 28 years trying to make sure you never had to carry what I carried, Robert said, his voice rough now, the practiced calm finally giving way. But I think I made a mistake. I think I made you carry the silence instead. And silence is heavier than any medal I ever earned. Jason put his hand on his father's shoulder. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, he said. That's the whole point. And then into the quiet, Captain Ray spoke again, his voice soft but certain. There's one more thing, specialist. The ceremony, if it goes forward, will be open to the public, the press. The unit you served with will send representatives, and Private First Class Daniel Kowalski's family will be invited. His sister is still alive. She lives in Cleveland. She deserves to hear what happened to her brother. She deserves to know who tried to save him. Robert Kincaid closed his eyes. For a long moment, no one moved, and then he reached down, picked up the paper from the coffee table, and held out his hand. Somebody give me a pen, he said. The ceremony took place on a cold Saturday in March at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, on the same parade ground where Jason Kincaid had graduated from basic training 18 months earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone. A young man had stood on this field as a private, thinking he was stepping into a world his father had never really touched. Now he sat in the front row, in dress uniform, watching that same father prepare to receive the nation's second highest award for valor. The review board had taken 4 months. Captain Reyes had testified by video link from a forward operating base in Poland, where he had been deployed in late January. Sergeant Morrison, a grandfather with a silver mustache and a limp from the shrapnel that had stayed in his leg, flew in from Tennessee and delivered his statement in person, his voice cracking when he described the moment the rear hatch opened and a silhouette appeared against the smoke. I saw his face for about half a second, Morrison told the board. Then he grabbed my vest and pulled. I didn't know his name for 28 years, but I never forgot the eyes. The board's decision was unanimous. The Silver Star would be upgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross, and the citation, rewritten to include the full scope of Robert Kincaid's actions, would be entered permanently into the Army's official history. On the morning of the ceremony, Robert Kincaid put on a dark suit at his son's request. Jason had asked him to wear the uniform, but the old uniform no longer fit, and Robert had quietly said he didn't feel entitled to it anymore. The uniform belongs to the man who wore it then, he said. I'm not him anymore. So he wore a simple black suit, a white shirt, and for the first time in his life he pinned the Silver Star to his lapel. Not the new medal, the original one. The one from the shoebox. He wanted the men on that parade ground to see what had sat in a closet for almost 30 years, because he had been too busy carrying guilt to carry recognition. The stands were full, not with thousands but with enough. The unit that traced its lineage back to Robert's old company had sent a color guard. Local news crews were present, their cameras pointing at a stage where a 2-star general waited beside a podium. Jason sat in the front row, his chest tight, his hands pressed flat against his dress trousers. Emily Torres sat beside him, a specialist now, her own uniform crisp, her eyes already glistening. And in the row behind them, a woman in her mid-50s with graying brown hair and a small photograph of a young soldier clutched in her hand. Her name was Margaret Kowalski-Ross. She had been 8 years old when her older brother Danny shipped out to the Gulf. She had been 9 when the chaplain came to their door. She had grown up in a house where her brother was a closed wound, a name spoken only in whispers. And now she was here because an old man from Pennsylvania had written her a letter. A letter that began, "You don't know me, but I knew your brother. I was with him when he died. I owe you a story." The general approached the podium. The crowd fell silent. The ceremony proceeded with the formal precision the Army reserves for its most sacred occasions. The general read the new citation in full, every word deliberate, every sentence a restoration. Specialist Robert Kincaid, with total disregard for his own life, breached a burning and munition-compromised Bradley fighting vehicle on 2 separate occasions. On the first entry, he located and extracted 2nd Lieutenant Marcus Reyes, dragging him to cover while enemy small arms fire impacted the vehicle's hull. After determining that Sergeant First Class Philip Morrison remained pinned inside, Specialist Kincaid re-entered the vehicle despite the imminent threat of fuel-air explosion. He freed Sergeant Morrison from the collapsed turret assembly and carried him to safety, while secondary explosions ignited the vehicle's ammunition stores. His actions, conducted under continuous enemy fire and in full knowledge of the risks, directly saved 2 lives and exemplified the highest ideals of the United States Army. When the general finished, he turned to Robert. "Specialist Kincaid, it is my honor to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army is sorry it took this long." Robert stood. He walked to the general with the same deliberate, economical movement he had used when he climbed into a burning Bradley. He accepted the medal. He shook the general's hand, and then, instead of returning to his seat, he turned to face the crowd. "I have something to say," he said. His voice was amplified by the microphone, but it still sounded small, a quiet man in a quiet suit on a very large stage. "This medal is for 2 men, Lieutenant Reyes and Sergeant Morrison. I pulled them out of a vehicle that was on fire, and I'm proud of that. But every time I look at this, I also see Private First Class Daniel Kowalski. He was 19 years old. He was the driver. He didn't make it. He was a good soldier and a good kid, and I have thought about him every single day for 28 years. He paused. The silence on the parade ground was absolute. "I spent a long time believing that if I just stayed quiet, if I buried what happened deep enough, I could protect the people I loved from the weight of it. My wife, my son. I thought silence was a kindness. What I didn't understand is that silence doesn't protect anyone. It just passes the weight down in a different form. My son grew up in a house where his father was a mystery. He enlisted because he was looking for something he couldn't find at home. And the whole time, the thing he was looking for was sitting in a shoebox in the hallway closet." He turned to face the front row. "Jason, I'm sorry I made you carry the silence. I'm sorry I didn't let you know who I was. I thought I was being strong. I was wrong. Strength isn't silence. Strength is letting the people you love see the scars." Jason Kincaid, 23 years old, a specialist in the United States Army, sat in the front row and wept. He did not hide his face. He did not look away. He wept the way men do when something that has been locked inside them for their entire lives finally comes loose. After the ceremony, after the photographs and the handshakes and the reporters who wanted quotes he didn't know how to give, Robert Kincaid asked for a private moment. He was led to a small room at the edge of the parade ground, a chaplain's office, simple and quiet. And there, waiting for him, was Margaret Kowalski-Ross. She stood when he entered. She held the photograph of her brother, the same one she had been holding in the stands. "You wrote me a letter," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "You said you were with him." "I was," Robert said. "I saw him. He was gone before I could do anything, but I saw him. I was the last person from his unit to see his face." He paused. "I want you to know he didn't suffer. It was instant. And I want you to know he wasn't alone. I was there. I stayed with him until I had to move the others. He wasn't alone." Margaret Kowalski-Ross looked at the photograph in her hands. A young man in desert camouflage squinting into the sun, the same sun that had baked the same desert where Robert had pulled 2 men from a burning vehicle. "My mother died 3 years ago," she said. She never stopped grieving. She always wondered if Danny knew anyone was there, if he was scared, if he was by himself. She looked up. "Now I can tell her. When I visit her grave, I can tell her he wasn't alone." Robert Kincaid took her hand. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The silence in that small room was not the silence of hiding. It was the silence of something finally, fully, completely finished. They walked out together, Margaret to her car, Robert to his family. Jason was waiting at the edge of the parade ground with Emily. When he saw his father, he crossed the distance and hugged him. Not a quick, manly backpat hug, a real one, the kind that says, "I see you now. I see all of you." "Dad," Jason said, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you." Robert held his son. A man who had carried guilt for 28 years, who had built a life out of silence, who had believed the best thing he could do for his family was to bury the most important parts of himself. He held his son and he said, "I'm proud of you too. I always was." And then, because he was still Robert Kincaid, still a man who liked a clean, quiet ending, he added, "Now let's go find a diner. I'm hungry." They drove off base in Robert's old sedan, the one with the squeaky passenger door and the history textbook stacked in the back. Behind them, the parade ground emptied. The color guard folded their flags. The news crews packed their vans. But on a wall in the hallway of the Kincaid house, next to the photograph of young soldiers in desert camouflage, there was now a new citation in a new frame. And underneath it, a small note, handwritten on a scrap of paper that Robert had added that morning before leaving for the ceremony. It read, "For Danny, I remembered." Some men build monuments out of marble. Robert Kincaid built his out of a shoebox and a silence that had finally, after 28 years, become a voice. The medals were never costume jewelry. They were a chronicle of courage. The quiet man was never nobody. He was a name the army would now forever whisper in certain circles. And the son who had once dismissed his father as unremarkable had learned, in a single afternoon and a single parade ground, that the people we love are almost always larger than the stories we allow them to tell us. That's the thing about legacies. They don't disappear just because we choose silence. They wait, they accumulate, and eventually, when the right person walks through the door, they stand up and demand to be seen. So here's what I keep coming back to. How many of them are still out there? How many quiet old men in flannel shirts, trimming hedges and gratting papers, and never once mentioning that they waded through fire when they were barely old enough to drink? How many shoeboxes are sitting in hallway closets right now, full of metal that tells stories their own children have never heard? The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates there are roughly 16 million veterans living in the United States today. Only a fraction ever talk openly about their service. The rest carry it privately, at dinner tables, in armchairs, behind eyes that have seen things conversation can't hold. Some carry guilt. Some carry grief. Some just made a decision decades ago that the past belonged to them and them alone, and they've never met anyone who made them reconsider that math. Robert Kincaid almost went to his grave with his story locked in a shoebox. If Emily Torres hadn't read that citation, if Captain Reyes hadn't been trapped in a burning Bradley 28 years earlier, if Margaret Kowalski-Ross had never received that letter, the whole thing would have stayed buried. A hero would have died unknown to his own son. A 19-year-old driver's last moments would have gone unwitnessed, and a family legacy would have been silence instead of substance. That's the thing I want you to sit with. Not the medals, not the ceremony, the question. Who in your life is carrying something enormous and just waiting, not for a parade ground, not for a general, but for someone to ask? A father, a grandfather, an uncle who gets quiet at Thanksgiving when the news shows footage from some desert on the other side of the world. Maybe they won't talk, that's their right. But maybe they've just been waiting for someone to hand them a pen. Robert Kincaid spent 28 years believing silence was a gift. He was wrong, but not for the reasons you might think. The silence itself wasn't the failure. The failure was that nobody ever asked. Not his neighbors, not his colleagues, not his son. We assume the heroes will announce themselves. We forget that the truest ones almost never do. If you're still here, if you made it all the way through this story, I want you to do something. Look around your own dinner table. Notice the quiet people. Ask a question you've never asked. You might get nothing, or you might get a flood of something that's been waiting for decades to find a door. And if this story meant something to you, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell us about a quiet person in your life who turned out to be larger than you ever knew. The algorithm doesn't care about stories like this, but people do, and every subscription helps us keep telling them. Thank you for being part of this. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, remember the quiet ones. They're almost never who you think they are.